introduce you to chunking. You've probably heard people say chunking. Tony Robbins uses it all the time. Maybe you've heard me use the word chunking, and it comes from neuro-linguistic programming and the hierarchy of ideas. And the hierarchy of ideas is really just a communication model of taking you from the specifics to the big picture, taking you laterally. And in there, when you look at the overall model, there's really probably a few different strategies. You have presuppositions to language. What people say, you understand kind of what their idea is behind what they're saying in these presuppositions beyond this training, beyond this video. You have 19 language patterns that control the big picture. You have 9 that control the specifics. And then laterally, you have reframes and storytelling. So your ability to chunk up to the big picture, chunk down to the details, and chunk laterally is ultimately leads to your ability as a communicator and your success as a communication strategist and your success in sales. So really, it's your flexibility of chunking down to the specifics and chunking up to the big picture and chunking laterally. So when you think of my sales communication strategy, we're at the bottom of the product and the details, and you have the problems and the goals, and then at the top you have the abstract. That's really what we're talking about, is when you're too chunked down, people are in a state of overwhelm. The product, the details. When you chunk up to the problems and goals, you hit that dopamine and norepinephrine. If you chunk too high up, you just put them in trance and you lose them. Now let me talk about the idea of trance versus not trance. Now trance isn't something crazy or esoteric or scary. Really, it's your brain waves. Your brain operates in beta, alpha, theta, gamma, delta. Or delta gamma. So you have beta, which is awake. It's your conscious awake state. When you're in conversation with people, you're typically in beta. Now you also slip into alpha. When you watch TV, you're typically in an alpha state. So when somebody's, have you ever been watching or trying to get somebody's attention that's watching TV, and you're like, hey, hey, and you yell at them 3, 4, 5 times, and finally they look back and you say, what? Because they've been in trance, they really weren't hearing you. And so really figuring out that right chunk level ultimately leads to you communicating. So if you're doing a presentation, you want to figure out what the right chunk level is so you don't bore your clients and confuse them with all the details, or that you don't say too big picture that you can't bring them to action. And so we've seen this in presentations. You follow somebody over the years that somebody's chunked down, just doing their product details, and the audience looks like this, they get overwhelmed. Or you've seen somebody that just is laughing and telling jokes and so big picture that nobody really understands what they presented, and they walk out and they feel good, but they have no idea what the guy or lady was selling. And so really, you got to choose the chunk level in your communication, and that's that flexibility of thought really comes from chunking and hierarchy of ideas. So let's take something that is probably everybody could understand. And if you took the topic of time devices, so you could take the topic of time devices, and you can say, what's the purpose of a time device? Well, chunking up to the bigger picture, it's the purpose of time. So what's the purpose of time? You could chunk up even bigger and go into time as a measurement of existence. But if you go to time devices and you want to chunk down and say, what are ways of telling time, and what are time devices? You have sundials, you have phones, you have watches, you have clocks, you have a bunch of different methodologies of telling time and time devices that are chunked down. So if you take watches and you want to chunk down on watches, you can chunk down and say, well, what are different types of watches? Well, you have different brands. You have Rolex, you have Cartier. If you go down to Cartier, you go down, what are different brands of Cartier? You have Roadster, Tank, and so that would be chunking down on watches and brands. Or you can chunk down on parts, and you can say there's hairsprings, there's jewels, there's perfect precision in measuring time and how they manufacture their watch, and you can really chunk down. So when you communicate, you have to have the ability to chunk down and chunk up depending on what you're trying to do. And so your ability and flexibility of chunking up to the big picture and chunking down leads to your success. And you also want to chunk laterally, and we'll get to that too in a minute. So really, when you're in any kind of situation, and I'll explain this, is to chunk people down. You simply say, what are other examples of this? What specifically? And if you want to chunk somebody up to the big picture, you say, what are the intentions of this? What's the purpose? And you get an agreement is found in the big picture. Let me explain. I'm trying to roll over a plan from a gentleman for $600,000 and put him into some financial products. He comes in and says, Matt, I don't like the products you're putting me in. And so if I go down and I look at those products, I say, well, for what purpose was I even using these products? What's the intention of these products? So I chunk them back up to his problems and goals. So the intention of the product isn't really the product in of itself. It's to satisfy what? Problems and accomplish goals. So when you want to chunk somebody down or chunk them up, you say for what, if you chunk them up, you say, what is this an example of? You say for what purpose or what is the intention? If you're going to chunk them down, you say, what are the examples of this and what specifically? So if we go back to the idea of telling time, and we say, what are some time devices? So telling time. For what purpose is telling time, or what specifically? Well, time devices. Well, what specifically is a time device? Well, we go through watches, phones, clocks. When you go down on watches. Well, what specifically about watches helps you tell time? Well, there's different brands you could kind of chunk down. But if you were here and said, well, time devices. Well, what's the intention of a time device? To tell time. What's the purpose of time? Well, to measure existence. So you can see how you can chunk up and chunk down, and we'll get to this exactly how this satisfies in handling objections and your communication strategies. And so the next very simple is if you're going to chunk up, you have to ask yourself, for what purpose? What is the intention? And what is this an example of? So could you go out in the next week and have conversations with people? And as you're having conversations with people, could you chunk them up to a bigger picture in every one of those conversations? For what purpose, what is intention, and what is this an example of? So you could probably, every conversation you get, keep chunking people up. And then you can go into other conversations and keep chunking people down into the specifics of the conversation. And so really, that's ultimately what you need to do, is have the flexibility to go from the details to the big picture and the big picture back to the details. So for instance, when that guy came in and said, Matt, I don't like this product, I could easily chunk him back up to the problems and goals and talk about, well, what's the intention of this product? And review his problems, review his goals with him, and then chunk back down later on back to the product and how the product accomplishes his problems and goals. So it's that flexibility of going to the specifics up to the big picture that ultimately leads to your success as a communicator and your success in sales. I wanna get restless.